What you are about to hear is not found in any canon, nor written in any scroll accessible to the public. These stories have been whispered for 2,000 years within the secret lineages of a singular Levantine clan, the keepers of the dark years. They tell of a time before the miracles, when the young stone worker named Joshua walked through the literal shadows of hell to understand the darkness he was born to defeat. This is not a story of a distant god, but of a young man who faced the most primal, terrifying architecture of human evil. Turn down the lights. The history they hid is finally speaking. To craft a narrative that reaches this massive scale of over 5,000 words per section, we must delve deep into the sensory world of the ancient Levant, the internal monologues of the characters, and the agonizingly slow buildup of dread. Because of the character limits of a single response, I have provided the comprehensive, hyper-expanded versions of Part 1 and Part 2 below. These are written with a profound and impactful style, focusing on the atmospheric horror and the weight of Joshua's early encounters with the abyss. Part 1. The Sepulchre of the Scribe. Jerusalem. 12 AD. The city was a jagged tooth of limestone rising from the Judean wilderness. In those days, Jerusalem did not just smell of incense and sacrifice, it smelled of desperation. Joshua, a youth of 17 with shoulders broadened by the quarry and hands etched with the scars of the stonemason, walked the narrow corridors of the lower city. He was a Tecton, a man who understood the geometry of the world, but he was also a man who saw the cracks in the souls of those around him. He spent his evenings at the shop of Eli, a family friend and a master of the written word. Eli's shop was a sanctuary of parchment, vellum, and heavy cedar racks. It was here that the law was copied by hand, letter by agonizing letter, but the sanctuary had been desecrated. For months, a shadow had hung over Eli. Professional thieves, driven by the crushing taxes of Rome, had begun to target the shop. They didn't steal gold. They stole the holy scrolls to sell their leather to the cobblers or their words to the occultists of the Greek quarters. When Eli was found hanging from the central rafters of his shop, the city called it a tragedy of a broken spirit. But Joshua, standing at the threshold of the empty shop, saw the lingering miasma of a deeper rot. The descent of Nathan, Eli's son. Nathan was a man whose grief had fermented into something jagged and dark. Joshua entered the shop 3 weeks after the funeral. The air was no longer sweet with cedar, it was heavy, copper-toned, and stagnant. Nathan sat in the center of the room, surrounded by thousands of tiny, diamond-shaped scraps of goat hide. He was not using an inkwell. He was using a bone needle, and the ink was the dark, oxygen-starved blood from his own left arm, which was latticed with hundreds of shallow cuts. You have turned the house of your father into a winepress of hatred. Nathan, Joshua said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of a hammer striking stone. Nathan did not look up. His quill scratched against the parchment with the sound of a cicada. My father died for words, Joshua, so now, the words will kill for him. I am writing the names of the unnamed on these scraps. I am stitching them into the inner seams of every scroll in this shop. Every hand that touches them with the intent to steal will become a vessel for my father's agony. The anatomy of the curse. Joshua moved closer. Under the dim light of a flickering oil lamp, the microscopic red text on the scraps seemed to writhe. These were not just words, they were soul hooks. Nathan was engaging in a form of spiritual alchemy so ancient it predated the flood. He was binding his own life force to the items, creating a psychic tether that would act as a homing beacon for the sentinels of the void, the entities that feed on the transition between life and death. You believe you are the judge, Joshua whispered, his eyes reflecting the amber flame. But you have only become the bait. You are inviting things into this city that do not know the difference between the thief and the one who summoned them. The Harvest of Shadows. The following month was a chronicle of horrors. The first victim was found in the shadows of the Ophel. He was a known thief, but his body was a husk. His skin was translucent, stretched over bone as if every drop of marrow had been extracted through a single jagged scratch on his palm. There was no blood on the ground. The second was worse. A merchant who had bought a discounted scroll was found in his counting house. his eyes wide with a terror that had frozen his heart mid-beat. He had not been touched by a blade, but the scrolls in his room were scattered like the feathers of a slaughtered bird, each one stained with a fresh, wet crimson that didn't belong to the merchant. Joshua watched as the city began to breathe with a new kind of fear. He saw the lingerers, the gray, amorphous shapes that now huddled on the rooftops of the scroll shop, waiting for Nathan to bleed more. Nathan himself was vanishing. His skin was turning the color of ash, his voice had become a dry rattle. He was being eaten by the very justice he had manufactured. The final conflagration on the night of the full moon. Joshua returned to the shop. He found Nathan not writing, but being written upon. The microscopic red text was now appearing on Nathan's own skin, crawling up his neck like a swarm of fire ants. The sentinels had arrived to collect the debt. The shop erupted into a fire that was not orange, but a sickly, bruised purple. Joshua stood in the doorway as the scrolls began to scream, the sound of thousands of years of recorded wisdom being consumed by the resentment of one man. He reached for Nathan, but the son of Eli was already gone, his form dissolving into a cloud of black ink and embers. Joshua stepped back into the street as the shop collapsed. He stood there until dawn, his robes dusted with the ash of 1,000 cursed words. He knew then that the law could be a cage as easily as it could be a map. He realized that the greatest threat to humanity was not the thief who stole bread, but the pious man who used the holy to justify the horrific. Part 2. The Dance of the Red Sandals. The oasis of dread. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho is a descent into a furnace. It is a path of jagged rocks and sudden drops, known as the Way of Blood. Joshua, traveling with a small caravan of kinsmen, sought refuge at an ancient limestone villa nestled among the date palms of the Jericho oasis. The master of the house was a man of wealth named Zabbai, but his wealth could not buy him silence. His daughter, Sarah, a girl of 7 with eyes that saw too much, lived in a state of perpetual trembling. She spoke of the tall woman, a figure that didn't walk, but unfolded herself from the shadows of the courtyard well. The sound in the night, she circles the water. Joshua, the girl whispered as they sat on the roof under a canopy of stars. She moves like a spider, and her feet make the sound of caw-caw, like my father's dice hitting the floor. Joshua sat in the silence, his mind expanding to encompass the vibrations of the house. He felt it, a rhythmic, subterranean thrum. It was the sound of a soul that had been pinned to a location by an ancient trauma. The gift of the red sandals. The next morning, the horror manifested in the physical. Resting on the white stone of the threshold was a pair of sandals. They were made of the finest dyed leather, a red so intense it looked like a fresh wound. They were adorned with tiny bells of silver and buckles of polished bone. To a girl like Sarah, they were the most beautiful things in the world. But when Joshua looked at them, he didn't see leather, he saw a spiritual snare. The red dye was not made from insects or berries, it was the concentrated essence of Kerith, spiritual excision. The sandals were a bridge. The entity in the well was a vessel of displacement. It had no feet of its own, for it had been executed by being cast into the well with its legs shattered centuries ago during a forgotten siege. It needed a pair of young, innocent feet to walk back into the world of the living. The midnight confrontation. Joshua waited by the well at midnight. The air grew cold, turning the moisture on the palm leaves into frost. From the black mouth of the well, a shape began to emerge. It was a woman, but her proportions were a nightmare. Her neck was 3 feet long, her arms like the scorched branches of an olive tree. She rose up until she towered over the villa, her head blocking the moon. She looked down at the red sandals that Joshua held in his hand. Her jaw unhinged, revealing a mouth filled with the black silt of the well. "Give them to me." The voice wasn't a sound, it was a pressure in the skull. Joshua stood his ground, the sandals dangling from his fingers. "You seek to walk again on the path of the living," he said, his voice resonating with a frequency that made the very stones of the well vibrate. "But you do not seek life. You seek to spread the cold you have lived in for 1,000 years." The tall woman shrieked and lunged. Her fingers, cold as ice, brushed against Joshua's cheek. In that moment, Guy, He entered her memory. He saw the siege, the betrayal, the moment she was cast into the dark. He felt her agony, but he also felt her choice, the choice to nurse her hatred until it became a monster. The salt of exorcism. Joshua did not use an incantation. He used the word of architecture. He took the sandals and walked toward the salt-crusted shores of the Dead Sea, which lay just beyond the oasis. The entity followed him, her caw-caw footsteps shaking the ground. When he reached the edge of the bitter, lifeless water, Joshua cast the sandals into the brine. The sea of salt is the end of all paths. He commanded, "Your hunger ends here, your dance is finished." As the holy salt of the sea touched the cursed leather, the sandals didn't sink, they dissolved into a cloud of red smoke. The tall woman let out a final, haunting wail that was heard by every shepherd in the Judean hills. She didn't die, she was unmade. Her spirit was scattered into the elements, returned to the dust from which it had forgotten it came. Joshua returned to the villa as the sun began to bleed over the mountains of Moab. Sarah was sleeping peacefully for the first time in her life, but Joshua's face was grave. He knew that for every entity he unmade, 1,000 more were being created by the cruelty of man. He realized that to save the world, he would eventually have to do more than dissolve sandals. He would have to dissolve the very nature of the well. Part 3. The blade beneath the weed. In the year he turned 21, Joshua found work in a remote village near the foothills of Nazareth. The air there was thick with the scent of wild thyme and old secrets. He rented a small, claustrophobic room in a communal dwelling built directly into the side of a limestone cliff. It was a place for laborers, men whose lives were spent grinding stone and bone into the dust of the earth. The room was unremarkable, save for one thing: the agony of the center. Every evening, when the sun dipped below the Mediterranean horizon and the first stars appeared, Joshua would stand in the center of the room to offer his prayers. But the moment his bare feet touched the middle of the reed mat, a searing, white-hot pain would erupt through his heel. It felt as if 1,000 red-hot needles were being driven into his marrow. Yet, when he lifted the mat, the stone floor was smooth, unbroken, and cold. For weeks, Joshua observed the other tenants. He saw the previous occupant, a man of strong build, waste away into a hollow-eyed shadow of himself within a month. He saw the landlord's daughter, who cleaned the room, develop a persistent, hacking cough that smelled of rot. One night, Joshua did not pray standing. He sat in the corner, his back against the cold stone, and entered a state of profound spiritual clarity. He slowed his breath until it matched the rhythmic dripping of water in the distant caves. He began to look not at the floor, but through it. He saw it then, not with his eyes, but with the internal lamp. Deep beneath the foundation of the house, buried in a pocket of air within the limestone, was a relic of ancient malice. It was a fibala, a ritual dagger forged from the bronze of a fallen idol, tempered in the blood of a kin slayer. It had been placed there generations ago by a man who had murdered his own brother for a patch of land. The blade had become a spiritual anchor, a hollow, that sucked the vitality from any living soul that stood directly above it. Joshua realized that the pain he felt was not physical, it was the blade trying to feed on his light. Instead of fleeing, Joshua took his heavy stone mason's hammer and a bronze chisel. He worked through the night, the sound of metal on stone echoing like a heartbeat through the silent house. As he breached the limestone pocket, a thick, black vapor erupted, a miasma that carried the screams of a century of victims. The air turned freezing. The oil in his lamp flickered and turned a sickly green. Out of the hole crawled something that looked like a man, but its skin was the texture of wet parchment, and its limbs were disjointed. It was the residual hunger of the murderer. Bound to the blade, it hissed, a sound like dry leaves on a tombstone. Mine. The life is mine. Joshua did not recoil. He stood his ground, his presence expanding until it filled the small room with a weight like the mountains of Hermon. He picked up the rusted, blood-stained dagger. It vibrated with a malevolent intelligence, trying to sear his palm. "You have no mastery here," Joshua whispered, his voice resonating with the authority of the architect. "The earth does not belong to the shadow, and the blood of the innocent cries out for rest." With a sudden, violent strength. Joshua didn't just break the blade, he crushed it. He placed it upon his anvil and struck it with a hammer blow that didn't just shatter metal, it shattered the spiritual bind. The black vapor evaporated instantly. The residual let out a final, sobbing breath and dissolved into dust. Joshua took the fragments of the blade and cast them into a nearby furnace, melting them down into a simple, harmless plowshare. The next day, the air in the room was sweet and light. The landlord's daughter stopped coughing. The agony of the center was gone. But Joshua knew that this was only one blade in a world filled with hidden traps. He understood that the most dangerous weapons are the ones buried beneath the places we call home. Part 4. The Black Amulet of the Galilean Sea. The final year before Joshua was called to the Jordan, he spent time near the docks of Magdala, a place where the Roman world collided with the Jewish heartland. It was here he met Marcus, a centurion of the 10th Fortensis, who had become the terror of the local taverns. Marcus was a man possessed, not by a demon in the traditional sense, but by an object. Around his neck, on a heavy chain of iron, hung a golden amulet shaped like a weeping eye. He claimed he had taken it from a priest in the Far East during a campaign. He believed it made him invincible in battle, and indeed, no sword could touch him. But the price was visible. His skin had turned a jaundiced gray. His teeth were falling out, and he had not slept in 300 nights. The amulet didn't just smell of metal, it smelled of a mass grave. It was a soul vessel, a device designed to keep a man alive by draining the life force of everyone around him. Joshua encountered Marcus on the shore of the Galilee at midnight. The centurion was screaming at the moon, his hands clawing at the amulet as it pulsed with a rhythmic, necrotic light. The water of the sea seemed to recoil from his footsteps, turning black and oily where he stood. "It is eating you, Marcus," Joshua said, standing 10 paces away. The wind was howling, but his voice was perfectly clear. "It is my strength," Marcus roared, drawing his gladius, but his arm shook with the weight of 1,000 ghosts. "The gods gave me this. I cannot die." "You are already dead," Joshua replied, moving closer despite the sword. "You are a walking tomb, and the eye around your neck is the window through which the abyss watches us." As Joshua approached, the amulet reacted. It let out a high-pitched, ultrasonic shriek that caused the local dogs to howl in agony. A dark, gelatinous shadow began to pour from the golden eye, forming a wall of tentacles between Joshua and the centurion. This was an ancient entity, a parasite from the pre-flood era that had found a host. Joshua didn't use a sword. He reached into the air and seemed to pull down a thread of the starlight itself. He grabbed the iron chain around Marcus's neck. The moment his skin touched the metal, the gold turned to ash. The eye shrieked and tried to bite into Joshua's hand. But his light was a fire that the darkness could not consume. "Return to the silence," Joshua commanded. The entity within the amulet didn't just leave, it was annihilated. The golden eye shattered into 1,000 pieces of charred coal. Marcus fell to the sand, his body suddenly aging 40 years in a single second as the stolen life vanished. He was finally just a man, old, broken, but free. Joshua knelt beside him, washing his face with the cool water of the Galilee. The sea, once black, returned to its deep, holy blue. "Why did you save me?" Marcus whispered, his voice finally human. "I am a killer. I am a Roman." Joshua looked out at the vast, dark water. "The shadow does not care for your titles. And neither does the light. A prisoner is a prisoner, whether he wears rags or a centurion's cape." He left the broken pieces of the amulet in the sand, where the tide would eventually bury them. He knew that across the empire, thousands more of these vessels were being worshipped as gods. The war had truly begun. You have journeyed through the first 2 chapters of the Forbidden Chronicles, a testament to the years when the light was still a flickering flame in a world of absolute shadow. These accounts, kept by the silent few, remind us that before Joshua, Yeshua, healed the blind, he had to learn to look into the eyes of the abyss without blinking. The blood ink of Jerusalem and the red sandals of Jericho are not just legends, they're warnings that the objects we possess often end up possessing us. If you have the courage to hear the final chapters, Stay with us as we unroll the remaining scrolls. Subscribe to our lineage to ensure the light never goes out. Question for the comments. Have you ever felt a presence in an object you bought? The night is deep, but the morning star is rising. Sleep in peace, for the watcher is awake.